Hi, I'm Ellie Anderson.
And I'm David Peña-Guzmán.
And we're the co-hosts of Overthink podcast and this YouTube channel, back for another installment of our series having conversations about a given text. The text in question today is Byung-Chu Han's In the Swarm, Digital Prospects. And we've chosen to focus on the chapter In the Swarm from the book In the Swarm. The chapter's super short. Like, Han's works are always pretty short. I mean, this is the book. I heard him in an interview him say that he writes 3 sentences a day and then mostly like gardens. So maybe that's why.
And he's written like 10 books, so you know how...
David, he has written so many more than 10 books. Like, so much more than 10 books. In any case, this is a short 5-page chapter, but I feel like it gives us plenty to talk about. So David, where do you want to start? This, kind of conversation goes along really well with reading the text yourself, but also it's meant to be accessible even if you haven't read it yet. So, David, introduce us to this idea from In the Swarm chapter called In the Swarm.
So, in this case, I don't think there is a better introduction than the introduction of the text itself. Because Byung-Chu Han begins by saying that there used to be, in the 19th century, a concern about the emergence of the category of the crowd. Suddenly we talk about there being crowds, these conglomerations or aggregations of people who act in a particular way. And so the introduction, and here I'm just going to read very quickly the opening paragraph to situate this. Byung-Chu Han writes, in The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind from 1895, Gustave Le Bon defined modernity as the age of crowds. He identified it as a critical point in time when human thinking was in the course of changing. It was a, quote, period of transition and anarchy. In taking form, the society of the future would have to reckon with a new power, the power of masses. Thus, Le Bon laconically observes, quote, the age we're about to enter will be, in truth, the era of crowds. And from this opening paragraph, Han goes on to say that nowadays, in the 21st century, we are witnessing a similar but novel transition in the organization of society, where now it's not the crowd that is becoming a new agent in social life, but rather what he calls the swarm.
The swarm, yeah. And a lot of this has to do with the rise of the digital, of course. He talks about Homo Digitalis. He loves coining terms, especially kind of Latin-oriented ones. So, yeah, this is Homo Digitalis. And this is the member of the swarm that kind of collapses, into this swarm identity. So let's talk a little bit about what the swarm is and how it's distinct from the crowd. And I would say I take him to be using the term crowd and the term mass synonymously in this text. And so the crowd and the mass on the one hand are distinct from the swarm on the other. So one place that I'll start is that the swarm has no soul or spirit, but the mass does. Let's just proliferate some of these distinctions and then let's get into what we think about them.
Okay.
Yeah. So
proliferate the distinctions first.
Yeah, So let's identify what the swarm is in contrast with the mass or crowd. So one is mass or crowd has soul or spirit, swarm doesn't.
Yes. Another one that he notes is that the crowd is made of individuals. The crowd is made of... The swarm is made of individuals who have a profile, so there is an individuality to each particular that is retained, and each individual is vying for attention. Everybody wants to be seen, everybody's fighting for access to other people's attention span, whereas a crowd is rather a group of individuals in which the individual loses themselves. And so you lose your individuality and your status as one to become one with the crowd.
And to be part of a we. So the crowd or mass has a we, the swarm does not.
It's many eyes.
Yeah. And another way of putting what you just articulated as well is in his claim that the mass or crowd is made up of nobodies. and the swarm is made up of somebodies. And so one way that you see this online is, okay, so everybody has a profile, even when you're anonymous. Let's say you have your main Instagram account, and then you have a couple of Finstas or fake Instagram accounts, or you're on Reddit and you are commenting anonymously. Even when you're commenting anonymously online, or even when you're using a sort of fake account, you still have a profile. And so he says, you're still a somebody, you're just an anonymous somebody. And that's fundamentally different from being a nobody.
Yes, because in a crowd, you are acting as a representative of the crowd, right? Like if you get caught, for example, and he gives some illustrations of what he means by a crowd. It can be something like a sports event, right, where you just get lost in the crowd and you become one with it. It could also be a political protest that springs up suddenly, and you just are there, fighting for something that you believe in. In all those cases, there is an effacement of subjectivity that cannot happen in the world of the digital because of the way in which the profile is the entry gate into digital spaces, right? You cannot just show up to a digital conversation if you don't have a profile that gives you access to it.
Yeah, exactly. And that person is optimizing their profile, exhibiting themselves and vying for attention, like you said. And I think, that's something that you see in some of Han's other works too, is this emphasis on what's come to be called the attention economy. And the attention economy usually refers to the way that our attention as individuals is captured by that online space, right? The fact that our social media apps are engineered to hold our attention, but can also be thought of in terms of the fact that individuals are then incentivized to get and hold the attention of others. And I think you really see that in these social media platforms. One final distinction between the mass and the crowd that I would add to this, and then maybe we can get a little bit deeper into what we think is interesting about this, is that the crowd, the crowd or mass.
We're going to get them mixed up at some point. I already did.
The crowd or mass is volatile, but the swarm is voluntative. And I will be honest, I don't really know what voluntative means.
I assume that I took it to mean voluntary. It's made up of volunteers. Like you choose to do that. And so he draws a distinction between voluntary and volatile. He does a lot of funny wordplay.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, he says here though, that even though there's that voluntative aspect, ironically, the volatility of the mass or crowd gives it power, whereas the voluntative swarm...
I think it's the other way around. I think it's the crowd is voluntary because you choose to participate in it, whereas the swarm is volatile.
Oh my God, you're right. Thank you. This makes so much more sense. Oh my God, I'm going to be honest. I was so tired when I was reading this last night that I was dozing off slightly, and I just got that one mixed up. So thank you. Okay.
It's all good.
Okay. Going back, hopefully, I imagine just somebody cut off half the video. They're like, I need to write about this for this essay, and then they're getting it wrong. Haha, joke's on you. No, just kidding. We're very grateful that you're here, especially if you're still here for us to correct ourselves. Okay, so the crowd or mass is voluntative.
Yes.
And the swarm is voluntary.
Volatile. It's unstable.
Yes. Okay. This makes so much more sense because this means that the mass is power. So they're the volunteers, right? They're joining, let's say, a protest or some sort of crowd, to watch a busker, or watch a dance on the street. So that means that they also have power. They are power, whereas digital swarms lack resolve. They do not march. Because of their fleeting nature, no political energy wells up. So if you're amenable, David, I actually think this is a good point for us to sort of think about this text beyond just an exegesis. In some cases, a misleading exegesis of these two forms. Because I wonder whether he's right about that, right?
I had issues with that part too.
Yeah, because it seems to me that what we've been seeing in recent years has actually been a lot of political will emerging through online spaces. I mean, this started quite some time ago now with the Arab Spring. I think that was the first time that you really saw this on a global scale, but now has proliferated. And so is it true that swarms don't march? Is it true that swarms lack political resolve?
So, yeah, this is where I disagree. And it made me think that maybe Han is operating with a somewhat outdated understanding of political power. In fact, I think it's an Arendtian model.
I think so too, although I actually think there's a real problem from an Arendtian perspective with how he describes mass, so maybe we'll have time to come back to that. But
where, Arendt talks a lot about the importance of group activity, collective action, especially one that is spontaneous, and it brings to life, hence her concept of nativity, right? Something new
natality.
In the natality.
Nativity.
It's a nativity scene. Something that brings to life something new in the moment. And he seems to be operating with that notion of what it means to be a political agent in a group, right? Where we have to be together in person, under a common will or a common soul. We have to share a clear objective. And then we have to be able to affect change in a sort of traditional way, either by stopping the forces of production, as in the case of a boycott, or by making our voices literally be heard, as in protesting outside of the city council. And I just don't think that that's how power operates anymore. It can operate that way, but it is not the right model for thinking about the digital.
So I think I'm in agreement with you on that, but I do want to add in another point from Han that I think makes his position a little bit more compelling, which is, I mean, he uses the term shitstorm a lot in this chapter, which was funny to me.
He uses it elsewhere too.
I think, was this in this 5-page chapter, or was it in a different chapter?
He mentions shitstorm once in this chapter, but he talks about it in another chapter too, in connection to Facebook threads, when people fight on Facebook and it just turns into a shit show.
So this is what I want to mention, because I think he says that online shitstorms prove unable to call dominant power relations into question. Instead, they strike individual persons whom they unmask or make an item of scandal. And I think there is something right about that, in the sense that what was powerful about Me Too, for instance, was, this cascade of people speaking up about bad behavior, but it was targeting individuals for the most part, right? It was like naming and shaming game. And I don't mean to sort of dismiss the power of that at all, because I think there is a time and a place for that kind of naming and shaming. And it's certainly been parodied in what's known as cancel culture, what's called that wrongly, I think, given some conversations that we've had, including on the podcast, we have an episode on that. But I think he is onto something in the sense that online shitstorms do tend to strike individual persons. Then again, I mean, I don't know that that means that he's like right about this, because I think online engagement, let's not say shitstorms, but online engagement also can call dominant power relations into question. So I think I disagree with him on that, but I just wanted to sort of say why he thinks this.
Well, they can call it out, but can they touch it? Can they actually leave a mark on that power structure? I think that's his concern.
Well, I mean, he says they can't even call them into question.
Yes.
Which I don't think is right.
And I think his reasoning for that is the notion of the profile, right? That when there's a shitstorm happening on my Facebook feed, the only participants are individual profiles. So everybody goes against one another in their capacity as individual profiles. And in those cases, it feeds this larger problem that he thinks is happening and that he attributes to a large extent to the internet. In digital spaces, which is the individualization of responsibility and guilt. And so in that sense, I think he's right that it's kind of hard to target the right, to focus on the right target in these online discussions, especially because elsewhere in the book he says, when these shitstorms, when like shit hits the fan, there is no sovereignty. Like, there is nobody who has the authority to put an end to the discussion. And that means that there is no respect. So he strikes a somewhat conservative tone in other parts of the book by appealing to respect and sovereignty of
which is
all
really
concepts.
funny because I feel like Byung-Chu Han is the darling of a lot of young leftists.
Yes.
But also like in the art world, which is not exactly the most genuinely leftist space at all. But yeah, he has, I mean, the first chapter of this book is called No Respect.
Yes, and I remember that he even invokes, if I'm not mistaken, it's been a long time since I've read that piece, Schmidt, right, on sovereignty.
Yeah, he does.
Where he says the problem with digital spaces is an absence of sovereignty.
Yeah.
Which means that there is nobody above the law that can determine the law and make that decision, that sovereign decision.
Wait, I'm so glad you mentioned this because it gives me a chance to read my favorite quote from the book, which comes from that chapter, No Respect.
Okay.
Sovereignty needs to be redefined in light of shitstorms.
Yes. And in a sense, I think he is right that it needs to be rethought in light of shitstorms. But I'm not sure, at least in my case, that sovereignty, given what it means and its connection to the state and its connection to the state of exception, is where I would go.
Yeah.
As, what we need today is more sovereignty.
Yeah.
Because I also think his understanding of digital spaces is a little bit problematic when he says that there is no sovereignty and that there is no power. Because that's the first generation of the internet. When the internet first came up, it was seen as this idyllic space of democratic equality where everybody is one and we're all the same and everybody has equal access, unlike the real world.
Yeah.
And many people thought the internet was going to be immune to, let's say, the monopolization and the accumulation of power and the abuse of power that we see in the non-digital world. And what we know since the invention of the internet is that that's not true.
Yeah.
The internet is filled with monopolies, with huge power players that control resources and access and power and so on and so forth. And so when he says there's no sovereignty and there's no power in the internet, it makes me think that not only his theory of politics is maybe from like the 20th century, but also his theory of the internet.
Yeah, well, and to be fair, this book came out first in German in 2013. And so this was before some of the major consolidation of big companies that we've seen in recent years. It was also before a lot of the political mobilization that has happened on these kinds of platforms in recent years. So I think you're right about that, but I also want to say this isn't necessarily a critique of like he was outdated when this came out, but just that even though by philosophy standards, this is a very, very recent book, when you're writing about the internet, things are apt to change so quickly. I want to ask you what you think about what he talks about towards the end of the chapter on solitude, where he says that contemporary society is not shaped by multitude so much as solitude. This is coming on the heels of a short critique of Hart and Negri, who have that book Multitude, among other works on the topic. And they say, he says, the general collapse of the collective and the communal has engulfed it. So it's engulfed the multitude. Solidarity is vanishing. Privatization now reaches into the depths of the soul itself. And I think this is a theme that you see come up in the other works of Hans that I've read. He has a concept that he takes from Peter Handke in the Burnout Society, like Hans' book, The Burnout Society. He writes about this concept from Peter Handke, which is we tiredness versus I tiredness, and the fact that as a society we've moved to this I tiredness, this isolated, like Netflix and chill, just be alone on my couch and order DoorDash type of situation.
Not speaking from personal experience at all. That was highly specific.
I know, it kind of sounds like my ideal night, to be honest, but no. Away from the we tiredness that you would have, say, among medieval peasants who would work the field all day together and then sort of like collapse at the end. So I feel like that's kind of in the same vein as that. So what do you think about this idea that privatization reaches into the depths of the soul itself nowadays?
So I took that to be part of his critique of Hart and Negri, whose work I myself have never been drawn to it. Okay. I think, so Hart and Negri do this quote-unquote update of the Marxist distinction between the capitalist and the proletariat, except that they call it empire and the multitude. And I've often thought that it's just a redescription of the Marxist distinction and schema. Just like
Of proletariat and bourgeoisie.
Yeah, just using more vague global concepts.
Okay. It's been a while since I read Empire, but I did really like it back in the day.
That's probably unfair, and, you know, I'm sure if I were to reread it, I might change.
I'm going to make you reread this next.
And so, anyways, here he's talking about their work, and he says the problem with them is that they're still operating under the assumption that there is this source of power outside of the multitude that exploits and dominates the multitude in the same way that Marx presupposes that there are these capitalists that directly oppress and dominate. The key word is domination here, the proletariat. And he says what's really dark about the status quo, and I actually kind of agree with this point that Byung-Chu Han makes. He says the problem is that now we cannot really talk about there being domination because there is no outside sort of villainous entity that is exploiting us through this vertical and asymmetrical application of force. Rather, what we have now is auto-exploitation, where each of us has internalized the values of capitalism and we exploit ourselves precisely because we are operating in the solace, in the solitude of our, you know, profiles, in our digital spaces, in our homes. And that, I think, does capture something that is potentially a characteristic of capitalism as it is now. There's a lot of self-exploitation happening.
And I think that's probably the most compelling part of this to me. I think that really does ring true and has revealed itself to be even more the case than it would have been in 2013 when this first came out. The way that individuals now not only feel compelled to be present on social media, but to monetize their social media platforms. There was some big interview that came out within the past couple of years where it was focusing on American youths. And the majority of them wanted to become influencers. And so that shows you that just over the span of a decade, let's say, there has been this radical transformation of the way that we are not only behaving online, but also in everyday lives, such that the imagination of the majority of America's young people is driving them to want to monetize their lives online.
To document and monetize. And the fact that those are the aspirations of a new generation tells you something, right? That's very significant. And Byung-Chu Han says at one point, I really like this quote, today, exploitation is possible without any domination at all. Because he takes domination to be a force that crushes you from the outside, like I am dominated by an external agent. But exploitation simply refers to a structural fact of your material and economic existence, the fact that you produce, you know, wealth or profit that then gets siphoned off to another place that is not yours. So exploitation is, you know, your alienation combined with, I would say, your disempowerment and disenfranchisement. And it all happens, in this case, through I don't want to confuse now this with the voluntarism of earlier.
The master crowd,
Yes, but rather something that we take on willingly because we believe that it's not just in our interest, that it's not just in our interest, but that it is also our desire. Something he talks about elsewhere.
I also love how you keep insisting on referring to him by his full name. It's never Han. You want to say the whole thing.
Because you say Han, but I also want to say Chul Han. But no, I know that's mistaken.
His last name is Han.
I know, and so because I know that I have this mistaken tendency or this wrong impulse, I just safety first and last name.
No, let's give the man some respect and refer to him by his last name.
There's no sovereignty.
It just got to a point where I was like, I need to address this. Okay, we need to wrap up soon, but I can't wrap up without briefly going back. Sorry. Maybe you get a pass because
I knew I was doing it.
Maybe you get a pass because as a Mexican, you're used to like multiple last names. So it's like the two last name format. Okay, in any case, we can't end it, to my mind, without at least briefly addressing what I think to be a very strange conception of the mass. So he's saying, like, we no longer have masses or crowds, now we're a swarm. So I think this happens a lot in Han's work, where it's like, we have moved away from this logic to this other logic. And he kind of got in trouble for this a while back because he said that we no longer live in a society of immunity. We live in a society of virality or something. It's in the Burnout Society, which is probably on the shelf behind me somewhere. But anyway, don't worry about it. It's fine. We need to wrap up. But so he was saying like we no longer have an immunological society. And then COVID hit, and everyone was like, "Oh no, we actually still do." It must not have been virality. Anyway, I'm sure somebody will correct us in the comments. I also have a video on that.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction between community and immunity. Maybe it's
slightly different, but in any case, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying, like, I think he has a penchant for drawing these kind of neat distinctions that once you probe a little bit more deeply,
that rhyme. They're all like solus, socius, multitude, solitude.
Yeah. Multitude and solitude do not rhyme, my friend.
But like. Multitude, solitude.
He was not writing in French or in English. Okay. In any case, a lot of the Latin ones.
What do you mean? Multitude, solitude.
Okay, people will correct David's understanding of rhyming in the comments. David, I just want to say a quick thing about mass. We got to stop this video. Which is that, I think it's a little bit too quick to say we've moved from mass/crowd to swarm. But I also think his description of the mass is very weird. And this is not the first time in Han's work where I felt like there's a misunderstanding of Hannah Arendt's work going on. I also think he has strange readings of Foucault and other people. And he doesn't mention her explicitly here, but you brought her up. And I think it's very fair to say that when he's talking about mass, he might have this kind of Arendtian model in mind, because she's definitely the philosopher who's most known for her theory of the mass. And I think what's really interesting about her theory of the mass is that the mass is not actually a politically efficacious we. The mass is, I mean, if it has political efficacy, it's in this sort of terrifying fascistic fashion. It's not the space of dialogue. It's the sort of, it's associated with the rise of the social in contrast to the political. And so for her, the mass is like not an agent of power that we should really hold on to. And I don't think he's necessarily nostalgic for the mass here. But I do
certainly not in that sense.
Yeah, but I do find her conception of the mass, to be honest, much more compelling than Han's.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Because, in her work on totalitarianism, this is where this comes out most clearly, right? That there is this logic of massification that happens under totalitarian regimes, where you do get lost into this absolute mud where you lose your individuality and therefore you lose your capacity for critical reflection.
Yeah.
And so we might criticize Han for maybe having an overly simplified understanding of the mass that kind of harkens back to Arendt, but maybe not in a very rigorous way.
Like the sense of individuality falling away, certainly, but not this idea of the we with power.
Yes. And I would say we might even also criticize him, although I like his work, you know, for the record. I've taught him, and it's really good with students. It really gets students thinking and talking.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's about their world, right? He's writing about contemporary issues, and so that's something that has a lot of value, especially in a pedagogical context. But we might also criticize him for his understanding of the swarm, because the swarm is a metaphor from biology. It is a kind of behavior that insects do, like a swarm of bees.
Yeah.
And the image of the swarm that he describes as chaotic, volatile, there is no order, is how biologists used to think about swarm behavior a long time ago. But what we have known now, what we have learned about insect social life is that even swarm events have a certain logic to them, and they certainly have a lot of power.
Yeah.
And they have the capacity to defend the colony, so on and so forth. Yeah. And so I also want to make space for us to think about the fact that these so-called swarms may look disorganized, anarchic, and chaotic from an external perspective, but for those who are participating in them, sometimes there is an inner logic that can guide behavior, and that maybe is not easily legible from without.
And that constitutes a we.
Yeah, that would constitute a we. I think a lot of people who are members of online spaces would say that this is a real community. And so it could be that Han is just thinking about the swarm as anarchic because he's beginning also with a metaphor that in biology at least has been slightly abandoned. Not the
Okay.
metaphor has been abandoned, but a certain understanding of the phenomenon has been abandoned.
Right.
Yeah.
Should we wrap up?
Yeah. So we've had a lot of fun shooting these videos. We hope that you enjoy them. Click like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also, don't forget that we host a podcast. You can find that podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. And we also encourage you to join our community of Patreons. Patrons. I can never pronounce this word.
Patrons on Patreon.
I don't patrons and matrons. To join our Patreon community. And we look forward to seeing you in our next video.